Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Syria. Russia and the United States still can't agree on what to do with President Assad after 4.5 years of war. But Russia's had no hesitation in going after ISIL in Syria. We figure out exactly how Moscow is paying for it. And of course, with more war comes more consequence. Whether they're escaping Assad or ISIL, the thousands of refugees just keep coming. This week we have Denmark's take on a European-wide issue. And rivalry in Asia. Indonesia picks China to build a high-speed train link, not Japan. Just what swung that on-again, off-again deal. Hello everyone. It's hard to ignore Syria at the moment, whether it's refugees leaving the country or military strikes going in. We're actually going to look at both this week, especially since Russia inserted itself into the fray with troops, warplanes and armaments. To be clear, that is in support of President Bashar al-Assad, who Russia's always backed. But it got us wondering about how Russia's actually financing this military intervention, because if you watch this show regularly, and we hope you do, you'll know Russia is in recession after Western sanctions over the Ukraine crisis crippled its economy. In fact, that recession is expected to last through 2016. And yet, Moscow spent $84 billion on defence in 2014, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. That is the third biggest budget after China and the United States. And it's apparently spent half of its 2015 budget in just the first 3 months of this year. That's what the Russian economist Sergei Guriev says. He also claims it's running a budget deficit of 3.7% and it can only maintain this for, quote, less than 2 years. So lots of cash going out. But of course, Russia can't get money from international investors because of sanctions. So right now it's tapping into a $60 billion secret fund. It's part of the federal budget, but not assigned to anything specific. But see, there's a history lesson here. Yes, President Vladimir Putin's been hugely successful in turning Russia around, and he's hoping more defence spending will help kickstart things once again. But some Russians point to the way Afghanistan crippled the USSR nearly 40 years ago and fear a repeat in Syria. This from Peter Sharp in Moscow.
These satellite images of the Bashar al-Assad airbase reveal the sudden expansion of Russia's military footprint in Syria. Latest intelligence reports suggest that an Air Force regiment with 28 fighter jets has now been deployed, along with a significant number of M24 attack helicopters. Uncomfortable reminders of the last time Russia fought a war 4,000 kilometers from Moscow. Russia's 10-year battle in Afghanistan against the Mujahideen ended in an ignominious pullout in 1989 and cost the lives of more than 14,000 troops. This was Russia's Vietnam, with its legacy of disillusionment and betrayal. In his Moscow apartment, Alexander Sokolov picks through souvenirs and reminders of his deployment in Afghanistan, bitter about how his comrades had been treated.
We were forgotten. We're still forgotten. We fulfilled our international duty. We did for the motherland what it, as usual, had ordered us to do. As patriots, we fulfilled our duty. Many guys, most of the guys, are now unhappy because of this war. They drink or they're sick or disabled, and the state does not pay attention to any of them.
There are few monuments to the war in Afghanistan, just one in the whole of Moscow. Those who lost loved ones in the conflict don't need reminders. Valentina Gorgievna's cousin was shot down in his helicopter.
He died a slow death, and the boys who got out of the helicopter, they were tortured. His death was a great sorrow, and that is why I'm so against the deployment, very much against. This is going to be a second Afghanistan.
Critics of the president say Putin has misjudged the mood of many in the country as he ups military support for the Syrian army.
The Soviet Union was a totalitarian state, and our president, in a certain sense, is copying Soviet ways and makes decisions personally or with a small number of advisors. So there is a high probability of deployment of Russian troops.
Ominously, the Kremlin has left the door open for direct military assistance to President Assad's forces. Russia may enter combat operations, said the Kremlin, if that's what Damascus is asking for. Peter Sharp, Al Jazeera in Moscow.
Right, so let's explore this further, especially the money trail from the Kremlin. Igor Sutyagan is with us from London. He's a senior research fellow at RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute for Defence and Security Studies. Igor, where is Russia getting this money to finance this sort of military operation, given it's a country in recession and cash flow is not great, and yet it's putting all this money into war?
Well, speaking briefly, Russia is taking money from its future, because they spend money which they have now instead of investing them to improve its economy now. So that is where they get their money, from the future.
Okay, so let's expand on that a bit more then, the effects of that. Is Russia then actually digging itself into a hole here only for militaristic reasons and influence?
Well, they believe in the Kremlin, it seems, that it is possible to solve these problems, and then miraculously economic situation will improve, oil prices will jump, and as a matter of fact they can, because this hot Russian intervention into the Syrian events, that is happening not far from the Persian Gulf, and that might lead, maybe the Kremlin calculates, it might lead to the increase of oil prices, which will help Russian economy a bit.
Yes, but as well, surely we all should have realized by now, oil prices are not something you can rely on anymore.
Yeah, certainly. But the problem is that the Kremlin's policy is to solve problems as they come to you, and they do not have very strategic view. They are very short-sighted. They do have some very clear and near problem, which is to try to reinforce Russian position in Syria, not to lose Russian influence in that region, completely lose it, and not to lose the opportunity to act in the Mediterranean. For that goal, you need a naval base in Tartus, and it's very good to add to that naval asset air support, which is another air base in Latakia. So that's what they're doing now, leaving economic problems, money, all this issue for the future. They do believe that strengthening their political position in the region, they can somehow miraculously improve their economic position too, sometime in the future.
Okay, so you're saying the strategy, the economic strategy at least, is flawed. What about the political strategy of what Russia is doing in Syria? I know everyone keeps asking this question, but what is Russia's end game here? What does it want from putting all this money into an ongoing war?
Well, you know, it seems that it is not absolutely correct to ask what is Russia's end game, because there is no end game. There are just many stages. It's a very tactical approach, because there is no strategy. So you just cannot have end game. What is the economic influence of this policy? The policy might be very simple. The policy might be not only to preserve Russia's position in the Middle East. The policy might be to have involvement into the crisis, which is sensitive for the West, involvement supposedly on the Western side, and to be involved for 4 months, until December, early January. And the assumption and calculation, the Kremlin might be that, okay, sometime in December, the EU and the Americans will have to decide whether to extend sanctions imposed against Russia after Ukraine. And it would be very inconvenient for them to extend sanctions against their ally fighting against ISIS. So they will have sanctions lifted, which will help a lot to the Russian economic situation. So that might be the policy, which is not the strategy. And the problem is that there is mistake within that policy, because Russian strikes do not differentiate between ISIS, which is the Western problem, and counter-Assad moderate opposition, which is the forces supported by the West. And this mistake complicates the situation and makes much less realistic for the Kremlin to have sanctions lifted. But they make mistake. And, you know, Brits said that it's worse than crime. That is mistake. So their strategy is mistaken by design.
Okay, I'm glad you've brought up the issue of sanctions there, because I'm wondering if you can explain to our viewers a bit more about the effect that those sanctions over Ukraine have had on Russia and her people.
Well, it is impossible to cut off sanctions out of the rest of the problem, because what Russian economy and the Russian government has now, it is nearly absolute storm, perfect storm. There are institutional problems with the Russian economy, which were not solved for long by the government. There are low oil prices, and on top of that, there are sanctions, which makes terribly difficult, if possible at all, for Russian companies to have some loans in Western banks, which are cheap by Russian standards. So combined together, they strengthen, its multiplication effect, a sort of synergy in these effects. And so sanctions are just tip of the iceberg, which are very important, but it's just part of the equation, one very important member. But the belief in the Kremlin is that if you get that specific member out of the equation, it will be possible to solve the rest of the problems. Oil prices might go up, institutional problems, well, after all, we lived with these institutional problems for 15 years, so maybe we'll manage to get out of them. So that is the mistaken belief, but that is the belief. And what the effect of this perfect storm on the Russian economy? Well, it's approximately 5% decline in Russian economy. That is the situation when investments are closing zero. So the future is effectively eliminated for Russian economy. That is the situation when Russian salaries, average salaries, dropped between 10 to 8% for the first time since Putin became president in 2000. So that is very substantial, sensitive influence for the whole population and for the Kremlin itself.
Igor Sotyagan, a pleasure talking to you this week. Thank you for joining us. So that's the cause. Now we deal with the effect. It's still so visible, isn't it? The thousands of refugees leaving Syria to escape either Assad, ISIL or both. Germany, of course, welcomed many refugees, but the response elsewhere has not been as magnanimous, shall we say. The Danish government, for example, tightened its immigration rules. Many refugees have still been trying to reach Denmark, but end up getting to Sweden or Finland. They're reluctant to stay in a country that recently took out newspaper ads in Lebanon, for example, discouraging them from travelling to Denmark, telling them that social care for refugees has been halved. Well, joining us from Copenhagen to explain that stance is Marcus Knuth. He is Denmark's spokesperson on integration and immigration from the ruling Liberal Party. Minister, thank you for your time. Talk me through, first of all, the changes to the immigration law which your party made in Denmark, particularly the changes on the economic side of things.
Well, we saw that Denmark had become one of the most popular destinations for migrants traveling up through Europe, partly because of our very high social benefits. And that's one of the things we heard from the European Border Agency, Frontex, as well. So Denmark saw a very high number of migrants and asylum seekers coming specifically to Denmark for the high social benefits. So we decided to reduce the social benefits by 50% to the same level that Danish students get in Denmark. The students get social benefits enough to actually live on. And we passed that law in September. It was proposed in June by the new government, and it was passed in September. Okay, then.
So the very simple follow-up question to that is why? Is it that Denmark couldn't afford to keep paying for refugees and asylum seekers that amount, or it didn't want to keep paying that amount? Which is it?
Well, we saw, because so many were coming specifically to Denmark, our asylum system and our welfare system, our towns and mayors were saying, well, the system is under huge pressure. So we decided to change our policy to send significantly more aid to conflict zones in areas in, for example, the Middle East, but try to get other European countries to take more responsibility. Last year, Denmark was the country in Europe that received the second highest number of refugees from Syria relative to our size. So we would like to basically have other European countries take more responsibility, and so that we receive a number that our system can actually cope with.
Okay then, so you've made the cuts by 50%, equivalent now to the level of what you're saying that students in Denmark get.
Right.
What does that 50% equate to now? We can extrapolate the rest.
Well, for a single person, it's in Danish kroner, It used to be roughly 12,000, and now it's about 7,000, and 7,000 kroner being just under 1,000 euros a month, which is what our students live on. And of course, then you get significantly more if you have a husband or wife, if you have children, and so on. And of course, everything else in Denmark, hospitals, schools, and so on, is free to everyone. So it's primarily the actual, let's say, unemployment benefit that has been reduced to about half. And we've seen a slight decline in the number of migrants and refugees seeking asylum in Denmark since we passed the law, in spite of the number coming to Europe and traveling through Denmark has increased quite significantly.
Okay, so we should actually expand on that a little bit more. You're saying that the number of, and I'll make sure I get this the right way around, the number of illegal immigrants has gone up, but the number seeking asylum has gone down. Talk me through that.
Well, it's sort of an ironic situation where we see migrants traveling up through Europe and choosing not to seek asylum in southern Europe and then in central Europe, and then traveling through, for example, Germany, Denmark, to then seek asylum in whatever country they choose. And since we lowered the social benefits, we've seen a lower number of people seeking asylum in Denmark, but there's been a sharp increase in the amount of people traveling through Denmark to then seek asylum in Sweden, in Finland, in Norway. But it's important to underline that Denmark will always bid anyone who comes to our borders, anyone who knocks on our door, welcome. We'll treat everyone very well.
You say you'll welcome anyone who comes and knocks on your door, but then you also took out newspaper ads in Lebanon telling them not to come. That's a deterrent.
Well, if you look at, for example, the way Australia has done it with a very very bombastic video saying, if you come to Australia, you will not be given asylum here. Denmark decided to put a newspaper ad that does the complete opposite. It's simply stating that social benefits in Denmark have been reduced. We're not trying to send any negative message. We're simply saying if you decide to travel through Europe and put your life at risk at sea, perhaps in the hope that you will get very, very high social benefits in Denmark, that is no longer the case. Anyone who comes to Denmark will be treated well. Anyone escaping from war and persecution will most likely be given asylum in Denmark. But the very high social benefits that our former government introduced have been changed to lower social benefits. So we want to help anyone who comes to Denmark, but we don't want the high social benefits to be the primary reason why people seek asylum specifically in Denmark.
It could all arguably be about to get a lot worse, Marcus, given Russia's involvement in Syria now, widening the conflict. Does Denmark have a position on Russia's involvement? I know this is a little off-piste for what you and I have been discussing, but we're looking at the whole issue in this show, and I'm wondering what Denmark's position is.
Well, when it comes to Syria, Denmark has been on the forefront of both the diplomatic effort, I would say, together with, for example, the UK and the US, but also in the amount of aid that we give to Syria. Last year, Denmark was the European or the EU member state that gave the second highest amount of aid relative to size to Syria. So Syria is very much at the center of our foreign policy, both in terms of trying to find a peaceful solution, but also in terms of the aid that we give, which we have additionally increased in the recent months because of the very, very sad and increasingly terrible situation, not just in Syria, but in the countries around Syria.
Marcus Knuth, immigration spokesperson for Denmark, we thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And still ahead on Counting the Cost, it was Japan which revolutionized the world of high-speed rail. So why did Indonesia turn to China for expertise with its own project? We'll look at that a little later. We are looking at Asia in the second half of this show. First up, Japan, where Prime Minister Shinzo Abe wants to create a $5 trillion economy that is 20% bigger than the economy is right now. But for that to work, you would need 2% growth and inflation every year for the next 5 years. And recent history suggests that is going to be tough. Rachel Mealy takes a closer look.
This small family-owned company has been making light bulbs here for 77 years. They're switched on by companies in Japan and exported around the world. The Japanese company has managed to keep its doors open despite the market shift towards more modern LEDs and being left in the dark by the Japanese government.
Is there any support for us? There isn't. There is no financial aid either. You have to do it all and fend for yourself.
He also says the Prime Minister's economic stimulus package, called Abenomics, hasn't worked, and businesses like his are feeling the pain. After a bruising couple of weeks in domestic politics, Prime Minister Abe is trying to switch the focus to the economy. Important growth figures aren't due out for another 6 weeks, but already the signs aren't too positive. There's speculation that flat growth figures could prompt the government to pass a supplementary budget later in the year in the hope of boosting the economy.
Given the recent weaker than expected growth trend, the chance that Prime Minister Abe would think about supplementary budget is rising.
Last year's sales tax rise hit the Japanese economy. After years of deflation, the sudden 3% rise kept shoppers away. Setbacks for the Chinese economy are also a factor.
While China is causing some economic headaches for Japan on the one hand, Chinese tourists are keeping some sectors of the economy alive on the other. There's already been more than 3 million Chinese tourists this year, each spending more than $2,500.
Some department stores have set up tax-free shops to cater specifically for Chinese tastes. As well as luxury handbags and jewellery, Chinese visitors seek out high-quality household appliances such as rice cookers or take home high-tech toilet seats. While the shopping districts are doing well, in a northern suburb of Tokyo, one company is hoping the Japanese economy picks up more broadly before the lights go out.
Now, another way for Prime Minister Abe to get that economic growth has been by strengthening ties with Asian neighbours. So it wasn't very good news for him when the battle to win a high-speed train contract from Indonesia was won by China. Beijing said it would pay for the project with a $5 billion loan, a loan that requires no guarantees. Step Varson has more.
The train journey between Jakarta and Bandung now takes around 3 hours and 15 minutes. That'll be cut to around 1 hour when the new high-speed line is expected to open in 3 years' time.
For businesses, this will be a lot more efficient, and also for tourism, because flights to Bandung are still very limited. Tourists will have the option to take the high-speed train.
The awarding of the major contract to the Chinese state company called China Railway is being seen as an embarrassing loss for Japan, which had expected to win. Indonesian government ministers say China was chosen because of the cheaper costs. Business people in Bandung, known for its textiles and cheap clothes, hope the new express train link will attract more Indonesian visitors.
Jadi ikonnya Indonesia ada kereta cepat kan ya.
Maybe people from cities all over Indonesia like Makassar and Medan will come to see the high-speed train because it's something new they have never seen before. This could mean Bandung will be profiting a lot.
But the prestigious project has already raised questions about what's more important, a super-fast train or connections in other parts of the country that until now are even lacking roads. The Indonesian government insists no state money will be used for the project, but many are questioning the government's decision.
For people in Indonesia, this train is not a priority. More importantly, we need a train to Surabaya, road in Sumatra, harbor, connection between islands. All kind of public infrastructure, which is more productive, is a lot more needed.
Indonesia says it needs $450 billion to build infrastructure nationwide and revive an economy at its lowest point for 6 years.
And that's our show for this week. But there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. It takes you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. You can also get in touch with us. You can tweet me at KamalAJE. Our business editor is at Abid Oliver Ali, and do use the hashtag AJCTC when you tweet us, or just drop us an email. Counting the Cost at aljazeera.net is the address. That is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santa Maria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.